David is the acting manager for the new development and renewable energy with the City of Toronto's Environment and Climate Division. Just move my screen here, where he has been focusing on planning for low carbon development and energy systems for over a decade. He works closely with internal partners and the development industry to achieve net zero emissions buildings. And currently he's focused on delivering mass timber affordable housing and creating online platforms to help energy developers leverage city-owned assets for renewable thermal energy projects. Very important stuff. David holds a Master of Environmental Studies from the Planning Department from York University and is also a graduate of the ULI Toronto Kurtner Urban Leadership Program.
Yep.
So I'll hand it over to David. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Brittany. Really appreciate that. So just wanted to start by saying, yeah, sorry about that. Just want to start by saying it's tough to follow Andrew because he was super knowledgeable about AVs, but also he's got clearly a way better background than I do at this pub here. So yeah, that's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. So when Brittany and I were sort of brainstorming this webinar, we tossing around different ideas and thought about something like smart buildings, which is, really in line with, I think, a lot of sort of what we talk about in Urban Techies. And my thought afterwards was, you probably all know this better than I do. And so what I wanted to pitch was this idea that it's less about the technology and more about the building. And so instead of smart buildings, I'm talking about building smart. And there's a tech element to it, and I'll talk about that. But the point is, then I'm going to show is that we need to build a lot of stuff if we're truly going to address our climate crisis, our housing crisis, etc. So that's just some context for you. So if you, in almost any domain, my theory is we need to build a lot. And an easy one to look at is the electricity system. The goal that we've sort of said is net zero emissions by 2050. What that means in terms of from where we are today and where we'll go over the next 25 years is, we need to build the equivalent of 35 Pickering nuclear power plants, which is what you see on the image on the left. That's a photo I took from an airplane. Of course, only I would notice the nuclear power plant as we're flying out of Toronto, but we need to build 35 of those in 10 times faster than the original was built in terms of generation. And I'm not saying that that's the plan is to build that many plants, but that's the sort of the scale that we're talking about. If we were to build a lot of wind turbines and other power plants, we need 14 times the land area of the city of Toronto alone. We would need 6 times the labor force. We would have to create an entire new hydrogen supply chain. This says nothing as well about transmission and distribution infrastructure to get all that power to where it needs to go. So again, this is just one example, but there's no path, I think, to, in this case, decarbonization that doesn't involve building a lot of stuff. Energy efficiency, demand management, very important. But the rules of energy efficiency typically say that there's diminishing returns on those investments. And I think in our case, and in many sort of Western countries, and particularly North America, we're so far behind building what we need because we've grown into what we overbuilt in the past generation. Now we need to double down on that effort. And again, I'm not an expert in AI, but the jury is still out as to whether this could actually improve the situation or make it worse. Right now, the demand from generative AI, the power demands are substantial. It could be helpful in the longer term, but for now, it's a bit of a question, at least. Again, similar story on housing and transportation. We need to build a lot of places for people to live and a lot of infrastructure. So what are we doing in Toronto to address this problem? Because, Toronto's a big city. We've got deep climate ambitions, but we've been building a lot. And so the images you see on the left there, what we're essentially doing are building the big civil works to try and displace natural gas from buildings, which is the largest source of our emissions in Toronto. And so what you're looking at in the top left there is a 130-foot deep shaft, 30 feet across the street from Toronto Western Hospital. That is going to tap into a sewer that's 150 feet below grade that is going to decarbonize all of Toronto Western Hospital. Virtually no more natural gas use at a hospital that was built in I think the 1970s, 1980s. And we're going to expand it to serve the new development that's happening on the campus. Bottom left, Enwave is tunneling 25 meters below the surface of the waterfront to extend their district energy system from the downtown out along the eastern waterfront and eventually to the Portlands. To the right, what you're looking at there is a shaft that's a giant thermal battery 6 stories below the parking, basically 6 stories below the surface. It's below the parking garage of the well development, which I'm sure you've all seen the press about. That stores 8 million liters of water that acts as a thermal battery that helps to decarbonize that entire development. But those are the big things, right? And we can build those and we should, but they're slow, they're capital intensive. They have a role, but the impact is huge, but it takes time. On the other hand, we can build a lot of small things, and we're doing that as well in Toronto. These 3 images here are all from one building, the Waterfront Neighborhood Center at Bathurst and Lakeshore, or Bathurst and Queens Quay. And what you're seeing there is a rooftop solar system. On the bottom left, it's a heat exchanger in the lake that eliminates all the gas use. And on the bottom right is a battery. All of that said, that building is getting off of fossil fuels, and we've done that project as a city-owned building, and we can do that over and over and over at the building scale. So what I see is an opportunity to combine both of these things. That's what I mean by building smart. And yes, there's elements of technology, of course, but really it's about the implementation. None of these measures are energy efficiency measures. These are all about ensuring that we have the supply to decarbonize these buildings, and it means building things to take advantage of that. So the last thing I want to say is that in the domain of housing, at least, I'm optimistic of where we're headed. And there's a real tech element to this. There's the bits and atoms in the same space when it comes to the new sort of advancement of low carbon housing. So really what you're seeing is an image on the bottom from a company called Intelligent City, where they use software to rapidly iterate the design of buildings and immediately transition that to modeling and manufacturing, and then eventually assembly. They use software to compress the upfront timelines, but also they can cost the components of the building down to the individual screw. And so they know very clearly what it costs, how long it's going to take to assemble, where they locate the floor slabs, where they stage the crane. All of these things can be done in a way that makes the process much more certain, more cost effective, and it has the advantage in this case of using timber being much lower carbon. So we're entering an era where technology is enabling this, but fundamentally you have to get to the physical world and you have to build things, whether it's power generation, housing for people, or infrastructure. And so this deck will be shared, and I included some links here on some of the work, some of the references to the work I outlined. And I'm definitely happy to engage after the fact, because this is it's fairly deep material, but worthwhile reading. Before I hand it back to Brittany and take questions, I want to leave you with these images here. So this is 2 images of the downtown about 20 years apart. On the left is Enwave installing their first deep lake water cooling intake into the lake, where they're essentially dropping a large pipe 5 kilometers out from shore, 83 meters down to the bottom of the lake. In 2023, they did it again, added a 4th intake to expand their system. And so I love it because, one, it shows how much cleaner our air has gotten downtown because of phasing out coal plants. But also, it just reminds me that we can build big things. And if we're going to address the climate crisis and housing crisis and other issues, we need to continue to sort of build on that track record and not stop. So these pictures just tend to inspire me, but want to leave you with that, hopefully, optimistic message. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Any questions from the audience to David? So I have one from the registration. We had an interesting one around kind of the social aspect. So there was one from Fariha around how can smart buildings or the methodology of building smart enhance the resilience of building systems and improve social outcomes in your opinion,
Yeah.
David, or anyone in the forum, really? Yeah.
So I think technology definitely plays a role. And look, when I think of resilience, for me, there's the social aspect, but if you don't have certain functions, the building, let's say it's a residential building, the building you have, in many cases, if there's a power outage, becomes non-functional. And so for me, resilience starts from the systems you have in place to ensure that you have some standard quality of living beyond just minimum life safety, some convenience that allows you to remain in place. That could be for your own safety. That could be to not burden sort of public infrastructure. Um, we want the ability to be able to, keep people in their buildings safe, comfortable, and have some conveniences. And so for me, resilience is about ensuring reliable backup power systems, and making sure that those systems power the things that people expect to be able to use. Maybe not to the same degree as they would during normal operations, but enough that they don't feel like they have to leave the building, which is unfortunately what codes typically dictate today. So for us, it's about what can we do with the existing equipment in the building to ensure that it allows people to be comfortable and safe during, for example, power outages. And I think the next iteration of that is, can we make that a low carbon practice? Because right now it's primarily fossil fuel based generators. The next iteration is, can we use solar and storage and other technologies, perhaps green gases, to make it so that buildings can be entirely off fossil fuels altogether and still have all the resilience needed to ride out any issues that they may face.
Andrew?
Thanks for your presentation, David. I'm sure it's because you were pressed for time, but the most interesting question to answer is, what's stopping us? What could we do? And I say we as a government or as a community or as a city, what are the changes that we need to make in order to get to a place where we start to build, or building is easy, or people want to build? Like, what are the barriers and how do we tackle them?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's definitely a few, it's a multifaceted problem. I think the one that's really clear from the companies that have done these projects, Enwave's been around for a long time. They're a lot bigger, but the sewer heat project was started by a company that is just a couple of years old. Companies like this, and this probably applies to the tech space as well, there's a dearth of working capital. It's less of a problem for tech if you're working on something that is essentially a lot more democratic. I mean, software is not cheap, but fundamentally, these civil projects are in the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Working capital is scarce in Canada, and there's not a lot of sort of risky money out there for companies like these to be able to prove their concepts. And I think that's part of the challenge in our ecosystem to early stage venture funding for a project like this is a big problem. That's not obviously a government, well, actually, you may argue that it is actually a government issue, that we're not getting enough investment, particularly from the senior levels of government, for this kind of these risky ventures. One thing at the local level, we need to get comfortable with using our space differently. All of these projects involve some use of city infrastructure or public space. And it's really challenging to convince our partners in various divisions that the city should play an active role in actually enabling this type of infrastructure. And sometimes it means compromising on the use of a particular public space. It might mean taking some risk in allowing, for example, Enwave to use our pumping infrastructure for deep lake water cooling. The payoff's tremendous, and yes, there are always challenges to manage, but government is typically not in the business of providing energy. And so that mindset shift is a big one for people. And I think that's on the big stuff. On the small stuff, doing things like solar and storage, the business case is almost there. I think and this is where the community can get more involved, is pressuring our political leaders to be more aggressive with our climate goals. The business case is almost there today without a lot of incentives. It would definitely be there if, sort of the base case was made much more expensive. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. We have carbon pricing, we have certain things, but we need to basically put in place demands for solutions like this. And right now, because it's basically tough to compete with the business as usual scenario. And that's where I think people like yourselves and others can get involved to pressure our councillors, your MPPs, MPs, to be more aggressive with policy and regulation to create that demand for what will be the next generation of solutions.
Thank you.
I know the budget was released yesterday, and I won't I'll withhold any questions around your opinion on policy, given that it hasn't even been 24 hours that it's been announced. But you know, I think just around the governance and the political agenda, and really just at the end of the day, sometimes it really is just, it's not about the tech, it's not about deployment. The solutions are there. The case, you know, studies are, we see them globally or in this, even in our, with the States, but it's really just kind of different political hurdles, right? So David Constant, I know that you had a question in the registration. I don't know if you want to say it live or I can parrot it for you here, not to put you on the spot. And actually, David MacMillan, do you mind going back to the intelligent cities slide? Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah.
I think that the question was a bit more general when it came to smart building, actually, but I was wondering to what extent we often consider smart building as a single unit. But what happens when you have a city or smart building? Is there something that the city itself can do somehow to scale up the local effort, or actually making building smart will stay individual effort all the time? There's no value in connecting the buildings together or harnessing the data. Is it becoming smarter somehow when you start to have a network of smart buildings? Is there a way to make more value out of it?
I totally think so. Like, for me, I can offer an analogy. When we district energy systems where buildings are sharing energy is one of the, you know, the great technologies or tools that we have to help decarbonize buildings. There's a lot of value in sharing. We don't do enough of that here. And I think adding a data layer to allow better management of buildings could be a great solution to you know, some of the challenges we face, whether it's reducing their emissions. Yeah, like I'm not an expert in what a data layer like that would look like and what it would mean between buildings, but at least within buildings, there are now AI tools that essentially act as property management. They really simplify sort of the management of large, increasingly complex buildings. So presumably doing that at scale could add a lot of value. But I mean, I think maybe I would be more interested to hear if anybody else in the group has thoughts on, because they may work in that space, to be honest, and I don't. And there might be somebody who has a thought on what that might look like.
I know Maria, I think she has a question, but I definitely know that she's worked in that space, so maybe she can comment on that. Maria?
Yes, sorry. Just a really quick. Actually, my question is two-folded, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Is more around kind of, you know, smart buildings. I guess the way we kind of started talking about it, it was kind of born from a technology perspective to be able to kind of understand the building from a data perspective, have the building respond, right? So I think there's an equation here, like your building smart is kind of leading to a smart building, right? So we want the outcome to be smart. Do you agree with that? Like, I think there's a technology component that plays into why we define buildings as smart per se, but it has to do with the foundation that is required, that kind of comes from the development phase, right? And that ultimately we will kind of collectively, you know, achieve that net zero. Do you agree? Because I don't think it's not a technology, I would say, problem.
I do agree. I think the part where I think technology is most important is with existing buildings. There's a
Right.
lot of low-hanging fruit, buildings that were built many years ago that have, they have no sort of software layer at all to them, whether it's a
Yes.
building automation system, some kind of advanced property management. That can make a huge difference without doing any physical changes. And the reason I like it is because it's a low-cost way to start reducing emissions, improving performance, improving the comfort and sort of livability for the people who live there. So the flip side, though, is on new buildings, there's no excuse why, like, they should have that built in already. because it's a
Correct.
marginal cost for a new project, but also we should be doing it in a way that's smart so that we don't have to retrofit in the future, which is the most expensive path. And it's going to be the hardest one to fight. So I totally agree. And the things I'm most excited about are using software to, again, not have to make or to defer physical improvements to buildings and also to the electricity grid itself, because I laid out the context that it's going to be super challenging to get to net zero by 2050 as a grid. We need to find ways to defer those investments and really slow the pace of demand growth.
So in saying what you just said, David, then is there things that we should be doing when we're building smart that we're not doing to realize the benefits of actually the smart building that we're kind of anxiously running to do with the older buildings, right? Because I think that there's no excuse then, because there are benefits to what we're seeing. Obviously, that's why everybody wants the building to be smart. There's that whole data. I mean, we're kind of talking about the data side when we say, okay, the insights, how we run our buildings becomes more efficient. Achieving operational excellence has everything to do with the operations of the building, has everything to do with the technology that we need to become that excellent model of property, right? So,
Yeah.
but is there things that we aren't doing, I would say, in your building smart foundation that there's a reluctance, because it's all about money in the end, right? It's all about do you find that? Is that also
Yeah.
a big deal? Like, are we preventing buildings from being smart in these new builds?
I think sometimes we are. Like, we're in this
Yeah.
transition period where buildings right now are kind of complicated. A lot of them are hybrids. They're partly decarbonized, partly conventional. The envelopes are not designed for a future climate. I would like to see, but the challenge is cost. I would like to see buildings being designed for a future scenario to avoid any of these retrofits. I think a lot of it comes with design. Most buildings would have the necessary digital infrastructure to, sort of be adapted to a future scenario. Yeah, but if they're not built, like if they're not actually designed and built to enable that, it's going to be a real challenge later. I'm not like, there are a lot of solutions that are sort of tech solutions that can be layered on existing buildings. Fundamentally, I think it's designing for a future climate that doesn't yet exist but will come to pass, and ensuring that the way it's designed and built now doesn't entail massive retrofits, because that's, again, the most expensive thing. So it means a bit more investment now to save time later. So it's almost about the model. Not everybody's going to do rental. So we need to find a way to, I think, make it so that, particularly for condominium developers or for those who are selling, we need to find a way to make it so that that upfront investment there's a value add for them. Because it does come down to cost.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. It is 12:30. I'm cognizant of everyone's time. I know David said that he is okay to stay a few more minutes if you guys are keen to stay on. And also from a logistical subscription perspective, we have about 7 more minutes on the Zoom. So, because we're on the free version. So, if you guys want to stick around, feel free. I'll be here. David will be here for the next few minutes, but otherwise, we will formally conclude the fishbowl now. Thank you guys so much. This was fun. I learned a lot, even though I've seen the slides before, just kind of through the discussion. So yes, thank you so much. And look out for the follow-up email. And yeah, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, and everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Talha, is that a hand raised?
Yeah, I just had
Hi,
like,
how are you?
I'm good. I really like hearing about all the stuff about building efficiencies and whatnot. Um, as a student as well, as like it's always great to learn and know about like perspective development and how you can have those potential efficiencies and like eventually that would lead to like a decarbonized future. Um, I think there's like talk about like pressurizing, I think, local officials, but like MPPs and MPs as well. I think my kind of question is like, what kind of regulatory mechanisms that you think will kind of help leverage like future building efficiencies and where like previous efficiencies were like not captured or realized? I'm probably thinking about um like legislation such as like the building code and whatnot. Um, I think there's like not previous, but like recent mention, and I think recent bill that was introduced by provincial, I think, legislature that kind of was hinting towards like the aspects or like the research of say PABs, point access blocks. But how can we kind of, I guess, like legislate those like kind of efficiencies and like high order documents where cities like such as Toronto, they have those specific efficiencies, um, and they want to capture those efficiencies and they have like rebates and refund programs. I think Toronto Green Standard has them as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you basically, you covered my answer. We have the Toronto Green Standard and we do have development charge refunds for that. But really, code is where the biggest impact would be. And you mentioned access blocks, which is kind of really interesting because I think it all started on Twitter. Like there's been people just tweeting about why single stair buildings are amazing, and particularly from the European experience. And
Yeah.
it's finally made it through the US now up to Canada. I don't think we're being as ambitious, aside from BC, which really is. But that's the kind of thing where leveraging the power of this case, social media, but just public pressure on our elected officials, eventually it reaches them. It reaches, a point where they can no longer ignore it. And code is it's applicable law. Unlike our green standard, which has its challenges, code is applicable law. And so, and particularly in our system of federalism, provincial codes are where things sort of would have the most impact once implemented. Yeah.
How hard is that then, like to get that into code then, into building code, having those specific barometers for efficiencies?
It's hard. Like it's a slow bureaucratic process, filters down from the federal level, right? And then municipalities have their input. There's a lot of politics involved because codes, if it's for energy efficiency or decarbonization, I mean, it kind of depends on your political agenda. So it takes time, but that's ultimately where you need to get to. And I think what can happen is municipalities who, they still exist within code, but we have some tools that we can use, like the green standard that exists outside of code, to lead by example and show how things can be done. So then it's easier to actually make those changes later. It gives, if it's political concern, it gives them cover to say, hey, cities are doing it, it's working fine, now we can adopt that. So I think it's not an easy process, but it's ultimately the one that we have to use.
Thanks, Talha. So I'll just gently step in here. We are out of time as per Zoom premium. So thank you so much, David. I know you have to go to your conference, but thanks for staying extra. Yeah, I'm going to officially conclude. I gotta get better at this. I'm gonna officially conclude the webinar. This was fun. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll send a follow-up email. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, this is
Cool.
great.
boss.
Appreciate it. All right.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Take care.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye bye.